No access to Gaza. Human Rights Watch says Israel and Egypt are preventing foreign researchers from entering the Gaza Strip to document abuses. Israel says it's conducting its own investigations and there's no need for outside involvement. But is it enough? And where does this leave a possible International Criminal Court investigation into alleged war crimes committed in Gaza? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Folly Thibault. The Gaza Strip is one of the most isolated places in the world. The territory has been under Israeli blockade since Hamas seized control in 2007. Almost 2 million Palestinians are cut off from aid, proper medical care and work outside the Strip. And now human rights workers say they too have struggled to get into Gaza. Human Rights Watch says investigators are repeatedly stopped for security reasons by both Israeli and Egyptian border guards. The report also criticises Hamas for not complying with international investigations. The rights group says this endangers both Palestinians and Israelis. We'll get to our guests in just a moment, but first, Imran Khan reports from the occupied West Bank.
This is the Gaza side of the crossing from Israel. It's the final checkpoint, one of 3 needed to be passed to get into Gaza. The journey's all too familiar for Samir Zakut, who works for Al Mazan, a human rights organisation based in Gaza. He says he's been harassed many times by the Israelis and is often refused permits to leave.
In my experience, like 2 years ago, right now, I applied more than 20 times for the Israeli permits, but all the time they reject or delaying or denying my application.
It's not just human rights workers. The Israelis control everyone entering Israel and the occupied Palestinian territory. Human rights lawyers say very little can be done to combat Israeli control.
What can be done is limited given Israeli law. There is no law to regulate entry. Israel controls access based on changing regulations, depending on what they claim to be security needs.
The strategy goes back to the 1967 war. The Israelis can impose restrictions on access because the Palestinian territory is under occupation in the West Bank and East Jerusalem, while under siege in Gaza. Various agreements between the Israelis and the Palestinians have tried to address right of access issues. However, things have just got harder for the Palestinians. The Israelis won't allow them to open a seaport, an airport, or any other kind of border crossing that the Palestinian Authority could control. The HRW report also criticises Hamas for not complying with international investigations, and it's critical of the Israeli army, which it says relies on human rights groups to provide it with information on human rights abuses that may have occurred during the 2014 Gaza war. Israel's coordinator of government activities in the territories is dismissing the allegations. Gaza residents pass through Erez crossing into the Gaza Strip on a daily basis. In 2016, over 310,139 crossings were listed through Erez crossing. However, the statement doesn't refer to Gazan human rights organisations referred to in the Human Rights Watch report. Imran Khan, Al Jazeera, Ramallah.
Now, this all started when Israel began occupying Gaza in 1967. Its army withdrew nearly 40 years later in 2005, and people thought that would be the end of the conflict. But then Hamas won elections in 2006. It's considered a terrorist organization by most Western countries. A year later, after a military confrontation with its political rival Fatah, Hamas took control of the Gaza Strip. Israel has been blockading the region since. In 2008, Israel invaded Gaza again. 1,300 people, mostly civilians, died in the 3 weeks of war. And most recently, fighting broke out again in July 2014. More than 2,200 people were killed. Both Hamas and Israel have been accused of committing war crimes that summer. Before we begin our discussion, I'd like to give our international viewers a better idea of the area we're talking about. As we've said, Gaza is a small strip of land with limited access. It's on the eastern coast of the Mediterranean Sea, bordering both Egypt and Israel. There are 3 border crossings. Israel controls the Erez and Kerem Shalom crossings and severely limits who can enter and leave the region. It says it restricts travel for security reasons. Egypt controls the Rafah crossing. It's been mostly closed since 2013 and only opens every few weeks to allow passage. So let me start with you, Omar Shakir. COGAT, which is the Israeli body that coordinates access to Gaza, says it coordinates the crossings for many human rights organizations like Doctors Without Borders and the Global Doctors Organization. So does this just concern Human Rights Watch? Tell us about the difficulties you face in getting access to Gaza.
Sure. For nearly 25 years, and especially over the last decade, Israel has maintained an effective closure on the Gaza Strip and has had what amounts to a travel ban for the movement into and out of Gaza of people as well as goods. Our report out today focuses on one particular sector that has been affected, and that is human rights workers. Effectively, Israel has been blocking access for both external, international, and Israeli and Palestinian human rights workers from entering the Gaza Strip in order to monitor compliance with international human rights law, as well as the ability of Palestinians from Gaza to exit, to attend trainings, to participate in conferences, to do advocacy. And that has had an adverse effect both on the work of human rights organizations, our ability to really monitor abuses of human rights that take place in the Gaza Strip, but also it's reflective of the larger closure policy. Current travel out and into Gaza to the West Bank and Israel is just 2% of the level it was in 2000, and this closure affects virtually every aspect of life in the Strip.
Omar Shakir, as you know, the Israeli government has long maintained that Human Rights Watch has a vendetta against Israel, and that your reporting on the Palestinian territories is biased, that you're basically engage in propaganda when you go out there. What do you respond? Because your report doesn't just point the finger at Israel. It also blames Egypt and Hamas, which controls the Gaza Strip.
Look, Human Rights Watch, we work in over 90 countries across the world. We've won the Nobel Peace Prize for our efforts. We document abuses committed by all sides to conflicts in every country in MENA and across the world. And regularly, governments that are concerned about criticism of their human rights record, instead of engaging on the substance of our actual findings, instead prefer to tarnish us with such a label. But the reality is, not only does this report itself criticize the actions, obviously, of other actors, but we have a wide variety of work that also documents abuses by Palestinian authorities and Palestinian armed groups. In fact, one of the arguments in this report, actually, is the fact that we've had, as Human Rights Watch and as a human rights movement, limited access to the Gaza Strip over the last decade and really the last 25 years, but really dramatically increasing in recent times. We've had virtually no access, for example, over the last 5 years, has made it more difficult for our organizations to actually document abuses committed by armed groups in the Gaza Strip. So Israel's really trying to have it both ways. It's trying to say that we're biased, but at the same time, it's actually restricting our ability to carry out our mandate and ensure protection of human rights in places like Gaza.
Let's bring in Mitchell Barak now in Jerusalem. Mr. Barak, Israeli authorities say that access to and from Gaza endangers Israeli security. But is security the real motive here, or rather stopping human rights workers from exposing Israeli abuses in the Gaza Strip, stopping criticism of Israel's human rights record?
Well, I think there's a certain amount of irony in this discussion because, you know, Omar has very eloquently pointed out that his organization documents real human rights abuses by the Palestinian Authority, by Hamas in Gaza and in other places. And I would think the Israeli government would want those human rights violations exposed. So I don't see an ulterior motive, meaning if that's what they're trying to do, that certainly benefits the Israeli government because the Israeli government has been saying that. The other great irony here is that Omar has been saying that it's difficult to get in and out of Gaza for the past decade, and he quotes a figure from the year 2000 to say we're much, you know, the entries and exit into Gaza are much lower. But during that time, Israel was actually in Gaza. Israel had settlements in Gaza, an Israeli army presence in Gaza, and Prime Minister Sharon actually decided to get out of Gaza and give it to the Gazans so that they could do with it what they want while protecting Israel's security from the outside and not from the inside. So I guess one of the unfortunate consequences that you're complaining about is that once Israel left Gaza, they couldn't really control and stop terror on the ground there. So it left the frontier or the border as a place that they could monitor people coming in and out. And I think that what Israel is trying to do has to do with the security of Israeli citizens. Again, we're talking about a Hamas government. This is not security cooperation between in the West Bank. Between Fatah and between the Palestinian police force and the Israeli Defense Force. This is Hamas. Now, the United States, the European Union, and Egypt all define Hamas as a terror organization.
Okay,
so,
let me just ask you this, Mr. Barak.
It is obvious that they're going to use those human rights workers to exploit that.
We have to allow Omar to respond, but I just want to ask you something. I mean, Israel's army had said in the past that it relies on human rights organizations as an important source of information for its own criminal investigations into possible crimes committed, for instance, during the 2014 war in Gaza. So why are they allowing, rather refusing foreign workers to enter Gaza if they rely on this information themselves?
I'll tell you, because I think that, if you look at you mentioned the 2014 war. In Lebanon, there were specific examples of using UN headquarters and UN schools as depository for weapons. When it comes to Gaza, it happens all the time. About 1,000 people are crossing in and out of there every day. We're talking about 250,000 people a year or so. And you're talking about ambulances that come to the border that have to get emergency medical treatment in Israeli hospitals. And, after a serious check, they find that there's tons of money in there. That money is being smuggled into Israel to go to the West Bank, to go to other people. There's also, weapons and other things that are being smuggled in through human rights workers or through medical people. And some of these people could actually be participating and cooperating with the Hamas. Some of them could be blackmailed too.
Okay, well, let's allow Omar Shakir
Gaza,
to respond.
And their families are blackmailed, and if they don't do that,
Omar Shakir, Mr. Barak says human rights workers can be used to smuggle weapons into Gaza. What do you say to that?
The problem with his argument is that these decisions to not allow human rights workers into and out of Gaza isn't being made on an individualized determination of a security threat. It is a general travel ban. Now, there are exceptions for particular categories of people. For example, medical patients, those that are part of humanitarian or aid organizations among them. However, human rights workers aren't included in that definition. So actually, as a general matter of policy, Israel is systematically blocking access to human rights workers. Now, if Israel had a concern, and they're allowed to do so under the law of occupation, about a particular human rights worker or individual, it certainly could make a decision not to allow that person in or out. But we're talking about a general policy across the board, right? It is grossly disproportionate to any sort of security threat they could face. And let's remember, as an occupying power, and Israel is an occupying power, they still maintain full control of who can come into and out of Gaza. They control goods coming into and out of Gaza, the airspace, the water space, the borders. So Israel is still an occupying power. This narrative that suddenly Israel has left and that, it has no longer authority in Gaza has been rejected not only by human rights groups, but by the United Nations, by the ICRC, by many others. And the reality is, since 2008, if Mitchell doesn't want me to use 2000, we have only been allowed as Human Rights Watch to have access to Gaza Strip a single time under exceptional circumstances in 2016. So we have local staff on the ground who I've never actually met in person, and that's a significant limitation to our ability to carry out our mandate, and it's grossly disproportionate to any kind of security threat that Israel could claim.
You talked about your local staff, Omar. What sort of conditions are they working in the Gaza Strip itself? Because those who are there also face severe restrictions and pressure, don't they?
Absolutely. That is absolutely correct. I mean, for one, they're completely isolated from being part of the larger organization. We can't bring them to trainings or to conferences or to really engage with colleagues in other offices. They're effectively in an island in the midst of what effectively amounts to an open-air prison. And of course, they also face threats from Hamas and by armed Palestinian groups. And in fact, we often face difficult questions because of our inability to connect our local staff with our international organizations actions when we are documenting abuses by armed groups in Gaza and by the Hamas authorities. And there is a track record of Hamas and by armed groups actually taking retaliatory measures against independent rights workers. So there really are threats from all sides, from the Israeli authorities, from the local authorities on the ground, and they do this work, really painstakingly difficult work, really without being connected to the larger organization. It's an incredibly difficult situation for them.
Mitchell, Barak in Jerusalem, you talked about security, but there is no denying, Mitchell, that Israel has taken a more aggressive stance towards NGOs and has even prevented some activists from entering Israel, accusing them of involvement with the BDS movement, for instance, the boycott, divestiture and sanctions campaign, and, the general efforts to delegitimize Israel. It seems like today anyone who criticizes Israel's human rights record is persona non grata.
No, I think that's a whole different topic of people that are coming in here to create trouble and to meet with organizations here. I think, if we focus again on Gaza, the Israeli government, and again, Israel left Gaza more than a decade ago. There's real humanitarian issues there. And, I think we have to separate between the Palestinian people and their elected representatives, the Hamas, who unfortunately don't always seem like they have the best interests of Palestinians at heart. Meaning, recently, the Israeli defense minister, Avigdor Lieberman, who's very, very right on the Israeli political spectrum, made an offer and said, you could really turn Gaza into a Singapore if you wanted to. And the Hamas spokespeople came back and said, we don't want to be a Singapore. We don't want that. This is not about Gaza. This is about the existence of Israel. And I think, once people there get it in their head that Israel's not going anywhere and the Palestinians are not going anywhere, and really the goal is to find a way to get together and work and deal with some of these humanitarian issues, it would be much better. And although, yes, it sounds very good, Israel controls the air and the sea, we don't control the tunnels, by the way, because the Palestinians continue to dig tunnels into Israel, into Egypt. The tunnels they dig into Israel are for terror attacks.
Okay, Omar,
and
Shakir,
that's what this whole debate is about. So, and the only reason Israel is controlling any kind of airspace or sea space is, to protect Israeli citizens. The second the terror stops, I've said it here in the studio a few months ago, the second the terror stops and the Palestinians, whether Fatah or Hamas renounce violence.
From Omar, Shakir. Omar, your response.
Why don't you try stopping terror? And
so Mitchell, has this idea that that Israel left Gaza. So let's imagine you left somebody's house, but you stand at the door, so you can still control who comes in and out. You can still decide whether or not groceries come in or out, whether or not kids can come in or out. Every couple of years you throw in bombs and other weaponry that actually affects people living inside the house. You control the water. You control every aspect of everyday life in Gaza. You haven't left. You've effectively still maintained full control. And again, this isn't the opinion of Human Rights Watch alone. This is the consensus international opinion. And under international law, not only does Israel have an obligation to allow the freedom of movement of Palestinians inside and out of Gaza, but under Article 43 of the Hague Resolutions of 1907, they need to provide for the operation of civilian life. It's not that Gaza doesn't want to become a Singapore. It's that they really aren't able to have the basic elements of normal, proper civilian life in what effectively amounts to an open-air prison. Now, look, we, among many other groups, have criticized the actions of Hamas, arbitrary arrest, detention, torture, a number of practices that really do affect the everyday life of Gazans. We're very concerned about the recent Hamas elections, which brought to power Yahya Sinwar. We're very concerned about that as well. But let's not forget what remains the primary blocker to the effective operation of everyday life in Gaza, which is Israel's crippling decade-long closure, which effectively turns Gaza into an open-air prison.
Mitchell, Barak, let's move away a little bit from the security issue. And I want to talk to you about the Israeli investigations, because Israel has said it's conducting its own investigations into the 2014 Gaza war, into the abuses committed there. What have those investigations found? I mean, and what actions Israel is taking in light of whatever findings they've had?
So Israel is a democracy, and Israel is a country that wants to always do better and always find what mistakes they've made and not. And, you know, Israel went to war in 2014, and there seemed to be a number of Israeli leaders, military and political leaders, that maybe weren't as prepared for the war as they said, and didn't complete the objectives of the war. So there was a lot of criticism. It was aired openly. There are some people that had a lot of explaining to do. But it goes back to, again, the Israeli government and the Israeli army is not operating in secret. Like any other, you know, like a country where there are mistakes that are made, and the Israeli public wants to know.
But is there
because
accountability
every Israeli
when mistakes are
family,
made?
every Israeli Jewish family is serving. You know, like most places in politics, we have a lot in common with people in the region, and there isn't always accountability. And there isn't always accountability, not in the next election at the polls, or you know, people losing their jobs, and people don't take personal responsibility.
Okay.
That's not always part of it. And you know, the reports were very clear that, you know, the government should have really known about the tunnels and what was going on, and should have been better prepared. And I think that's, you know, that may be affecting some of the decisions now related to security and how you have to really be careful. You know, just one example. I mean, when the Palestinians in Gaza try and smuggle in diving suits, it's not for the Gaza Strip, you know, surf and diving club. It's so that they can go underwater.
We're talking about
and then go into Israel and launch terror attacks.
Okay. Let's move away from that just a moment. And Omar, I want to bring in something in your report now. You talked about Hamas and Israel, but also Egypt. What about Egypt's responsibility here in allowing access to human rights workers? Because Egypt also has a crossing into Gaza.
Sure, and I think, you know, just to respond briefly to what Mitchell said, you know, Israel, he mentions, as a democracy. Its standard for accountability shouldn't be Syria or Egypt or those in the region, as he mentioned. And there hasn't really been accountability, and that's one of the central points of this report, is that Israel is currently, there's a preliminary examination in front of the International Criminal Court. We presented our report to the ICC, and we make clear that Israel, that the fact that they're blocking access for human rights workers suggests that their willingness and ability to conduct serious investigations are in doubt. The Israeli human rights organization Beit Salem has in fact said that it's a whitewash operation. In terms of Egypt, of course, Egypt plays an incredibly destructive, really, role when it comes to Gaza and in hampering the everyday life of Gazans. And our report documents the role of Egypt and the fact that Rafah has been effectively closed. Now, the difference, though, between Egypt and Israel is that Egypt is not an occupying power of Gaza. That is ultimately Israel. So our report does call on Egypt in fulfilling its requirements under the 4th Geneva Convention to ensure that it does provide for a population living under occupation with the ability, you know, to not be contributing to human rights abuse and to not be, and to allow for the functioning of civilian life. So we strongly criticize the Egyptian authorities for for what they do to prevent people from getting into and out of Gaza, but ultimately the primary responsibility is on the Israeli authorities as the occupying power in Gaza.
Finally, Omar, quickly, where does this leave the ICC's preliminary investigation into these alleged war crimes committed during the 2014 Gaza war? Can there be any progress there?
So the International Criminal Court right now is doing two things. One, it is assessing whether or not crimes that fall within the mandate of the ICC, Palestine is a member state, warrant having jurisdiction. And secondly, because the ICC is a court of last resort, it only takes cases when domestic national investigations have been exhausted. It's in the process of really checking now whether or not sufficient crimes have been committed, and secondly, whether or not there have been local courts, Israeli courts, that are investigating properly. And our recommendation has been very clear. The crimes, what happened in Gaza, also settlements, which are war crimes, have taken place in the territory of a member state of Palestine, which includes the West Bank and Gaza. And secondly, that Israeli investigations really haven't been able to have real accountability. So we call on the International Criminal Court to immediately shift its examination into a formal investigation and to hold all perpetrators of serious crimes to account for their actions. Until that happens, we will continue to see human rights abuse, and we'll continue to see instability and lack of peace in Israel and Palestine. Okay,
Mitchell, quickly, you have the last word.
Yeah, no, I mean, to call settlements war crimes is a little bit of a stretch. Settlements building in areas A, B, and C on the West Bank are stipulated in the Oslo Accords, and the settlements have been around for decades.
Okay.
So if they were really war crimes, I would think that they would be able to stop them or bring Israel to justice. That's not the case. They're not going to find war crimes from 2014. This is all, media. It's PR. It's a lot of bluff because there were none. And Israel, any time that there is a complaint, there is a problem. As Omar says, it goes through the Israeli military court system, and they investigate it. They want to know what happens. The bottom line is, since 2014, is the Hezbollah was hiding behind the Hamas was hiding behind the civilian population. In order to, and in hospitals and in schools.
There, unfortunately,
and that's really a war crime.
We've run out of time. Thank you very much for a very interesting discussion. Omar, Shakir, Mitchell, Barak, thank you both for joining us today on Inside Story. And thank you as well for watching. You can always watch this program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. For further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can, of course, also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Folly, Thibault, and the whole team, thanks for watching. Bye for now.